Hi, and welcome to Retro Decade. Today we're starting something new that I'd like to lovingly call Power Supply. The idea here is that I have a number of Nintendo Power issues, and I received them all of the time when I was a kid, and there was just nothing better than actually getting one of these in the mail. I want to be able to share that experience with you. A few quick things before we start. Number one, I can't really guarantee the frequency of this, although I will try to update regularly. Also, we will not be going through them in order. You'll see that today I didn't even start at number 1. That's because I don't currently own all issues of Nintendo Power, so if we tried to go in order, it wouldn't take long to run into one that I don't currently have. Also, by jumping from issue to issue, that'll keep us from seeing the same games and consoles over and over again. So let's go ahead and kick off this first episode. So, to start things off, let's take a look at this cover. There's something wonderfully nostalgic about seeing Tony Hawk flying through the air like that. I would say it's very 90s, but this issue is actually from 2001. So let's take a look at a few of the headlines. Nintendo rocks E3. I'm not sure if Sony and Microsoft agree, but I certainly felt that way. Advanced strategies for Castlevania, Circle of the Moon, and Bomberman Tournament. Oh, that's nice. Celebi revealed. At some point I apparently tried to remove my address from the front of this, and did a very poor job, so sorry, the Celebi is a little bit ripped. And of course the main cover is telling us all about Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, which was on both Nintendo 64 and on Game Boy Color. When I received a new Nintendo Power, I'd always start at the player's pulse. Let's see what they've got in here today. There's certainly a lot of chatter about the Game Boy Advance, which makes sense because it had only been out for a month at this point. Here's somebody named Jared goes on to mention just how excited they are about the improved battery life. That is definitely something that we don't think about as much nowadays. Then there's the letter of the month. Anonymous says, I was surfing the net today and I discovered a site where you can find the meaning of names. So I decided to look up some famous Nintendo characters. Mario means one who is manly or rebellious. Zelda means gray-haired battle heroine. And most shockingly of all, Luigi means famous warrior. I always enjoyed Nintendo's responses, partly because of just how much they shamelessly advertise. Nintendo responds, someone must have heard about Luigi's Mansion, the new GameCube adventure starring everyone's favorite green-clad plumber. But other Nintendo names have some unusual meanings as well. Ash means blessed or happy. Soraya means princess. Kirby means from the church village.
What?
And Brock means badger. Over here on page 10, we find a letter written by Nancy Sweeney. Name that hero. I was recently playing Dragon Warrior, and I noticed that in the Game Boy Color version, people ask you, art thou a descendant of Lodo? But on my NES, they say, art thou a descendant of Erdrick? I was just wondering what it meant. Nintendo replies, according to Enix, the makers of the Dragon Warrior series, Erdrick's name was changed to Lodo so that it would fit on one line of the Game Boy Color screen. It's pretty neat nowadays to read about a time at which video game consoles even had limits on how much text they could fit. Then Ryan, via mail, sends in, I love dogs, and my brother's N64. Why don't you make a dog game? I know Zelda games have dogs, but I want a game that's all about dogs. First off, I love the line, I love dogs and my brother's N64. That about sums it up. What I do find interesting about this is that about 4 years after this is when Nintendo released Nintendogs. Sadly, for our friend Ryan, it wasn't released on the Nintendo 64, but rather the Nintendo DS. So it sounds like he's going to have to strike up love with yet another one of his brother's consoles. Another wonderful thing that you find in these magazines is all the great art that kids send in. A lot of them colored the envelopes that they sent, and others sent just pages by themselves, but if you were someone that sent one of these in, and especially if you've had one featured, be sure to leave a comment and let me know. That'd be really neat to find. On page 14 we find a segment called Game Watch, the only inside source for all Nintendo news. While I'm not going to focus too hard on this, I did like that they gave the announcement of the Nintendo GameCube releasing for $199.95. Nowadays, that's a phenomenal price for a brand new AAA console. However, back then it was still pretty good as well, and one of the ways that I was able to sell my parents on getting one for me. Another quick note, I don't intend to spend much time focusing on the reviews in these magazines. It's nice if you own the game or if it's a game you're really interested in, but it's more a product of the time. And here's the main attraction of this issue. E3 2001 coverage. Nintendo GameCube steals the show. While I can't say for other people what the Electronics Entertainment Expo of 2001 meant, to me it was huge. Nintendo introduced the Nintendo GameCube and presented all sorts of add-ons for both it and the Game Boy Advance. And they also announced so many great games. Let's take a look at a few. Top of the list, and for good reason, was the announcement of Super Smash Bros. Melee, a sequel to Nintendo's hit Nintendo 64 brawler. For as great as the N64 game was, Melee was a huge step up. Tons more characters, more levels, and more mechanic. And much of that was obvious through this revelation at E3. The hype was huge, and carries on to this day as there's still a large fandom for this game. In retrospect, Super Smash Bros. Melee is probably the most complete sequel a video game has ever received. Next up was Luigi's Mansion, which once again was another phenomenal AAA game. This game introduced Luigi as the main protagonist for one of the first times ever, excluding Mario is Missing for the SNES. While making a horror game in the Mario series is a little bit of an odd prospect, it worked surprisingly well, and this game was so successful that it went on to produce 2 more sequels. The next big announcement here is Pikmin, a puzzle platforming game for the GameCube. At the time, not a lot was actually known about it, but as you'll hear me say for more than once in this segment, it went on to become a wildly successful franchise for Nintendo, and has had multiple sequels. On page 38, we're shown our first look at Eternal Darkness. For all the belief that there was something inherently E for everyone about the GameCube, shortly after launch it received an absolute classic of an M-rated horror game. One word of advice, if you haven't played Eternal Darkness yet but intend to, don't watch any reviews or gameplay. It's better if you go into it blind. Star Fox Adventures Dinosaur Planet, which would ultimately be known as just Star Fox Adventures, was teased. While developer Rare certainly took the starfighting fox to places never expected, it was ultimately a good platform puzzler hidden behind a coat of Star Fox paint. It's also the only game to have ever caused me to spend $15 on a roll of toilet paper. So... There's also the announcement of Metroid Prime. No gameplay was available at the conference, but a trailer was shown. In the years since, 2 sequels have been released, and Nintendo is currently hinting at yet another one. On page 40, we're greeted with a pending game named Animal Forest. Another trailer-only showing, this would later be known by its final title, Animal Crossing. As with so many others of these games, a quite successful franchise was spawned from it in the years to come. Other notable GameCube titles teased here were Star Wars Rogue Leader, Wave Race Blue Storm, Cameo Elements of Power, NBA Courtside 2002, Raven Blade, Phantasy Star Online, Super Monkey Ball, and Disney's Mickey for GameCube, which was later named Disney's Magical Mirror starring Mickey Mouse. The GameCube portion of the coverage wraps up with some tech demos that were shown. The first was titled Donkey Kong Racing, and looked to be proof of a sequel to Diddy Kong Racing from the N64. Unfortunately, the demo video was all that would ever come of it. Then there's the Legend of Zelda tech demo, which aimed to show fans of the franchise just how amazing and realistic the game could look on the new hardware. I remember being absolutely ecstatic about just how lifelike and gritty this made the battle between Link and Ganon look. This was essentially a guarantee that the haters and their kitty console chants would have to eat crow whenever Nintendo inevitably would release its most graphically masterful and deeply realistic Zelda title to date. What? Salty? Me? Nah. There were a number of GBA games teased as well, and I'll admit that I didn't pay as much attention to them, although some are probably very deserving. Advance Wars, Sonic Advance, and Wario Land 4 were all certainly noteworthy. One thing that did catch my eye, though, was even more pending rare titles that didn't come to be. Diddy Kong Pilot appears to have been a handheld successor to Diddy Kong Racing. Unfortunately, it never released. Rare did eventually bring a port of Diddy Kong Racing to the DS in 2007. Donkey Kong Coconut Crackers was supposed to be a puzzle game within the Donkey Kong franchise. While it didn't come out as planned, it did actually get released 3 years later as It's Mr. Pan. So why were there so many DK games that were poised to be made by Rare, but ultimately were not? Well, that's because shortly after this is when Microsoft began making the moves that would ultimately lead to them owning Rare in 2002. To end the coverage on a high note, it appears that Miyamoto received a pretty awesome gift in the form of this Zora guitar. A gift like that is worthy of such a reaction. Another one of the wonderful things you got in Nintendo Power were these advertisements. I think my favorite out of this issue is for Super Dodgeball by Atlas. Wimps, wusses, and crybabies need not apply. Something that you may not remember about the 90s and early 2000s was that the distribution of cheat codes had been a large focus of magazines and offline media. I remember getting a book through the Scholastic book program that was something like 1001 codes for the Nintendo 64. Nintendo Power was no different, so at the time, they had this segment, Classified Information. Of course, as the internet became a major part of Western life that it is today, this died off since a quick web search would bring you any code in existence for games. Still, page 55 brings us something of interest. Code Cop. After a quick diatribe about the evils of game sharks, the Code Cop goes on to explain. On a lighter note, a good citizen wanted to know if Luigi is available in Super Mario 64, and the answer is no. If you saw a screenshot on the internet, it was fake. Code Cop over and out. What makes this particular rumor especially of interest is that recently massive leaks have come to light from Nintendo. Among them was the unused code of Luigi actually being in an early build of SM64. Technically, the Code Cop is correct. That code was never present in the final game. But it's still neat to see just how close it came. After a couple reviews, we find the Counselor's Corner, which looks to be a much slower and in-print version of the Nintendo Helpline. It mainly consists of common questions about how to clear difficult or confusing parts of games, usually a few at a time. It concludes with a question and answer fast fact section that is more of the same, but in a lightning format. Page 67 has a surprisingly short review of Pokemon Crystal. However, issue 147 would headline the game. After a few more reviews, we come to the Poké Center, and this month it's focused again on E3 2001. While the coverage is short, we're greeted with images of the newly announced e-reader attachment for the Game Boy, the title screen to Pokemon Crystal, and the absolute horror that was the Pokemon Gold and Silver Tour Lugia Chrysler PT Cruiser. It turns out 5 of these were made, and while I do actually think that the Pokemon-themed cars are a clever idea, as a former mechanic, I can tell you that PT Cruisers should strike fear into anyone who has owned or had to upkeep one. Other notable things in this section are the PokeChat, which is another question and answer style section that is focused solely on the Pokemon games, the Coliseum, in which one lucky reader a month gets to show off their team of 6 Pokemon, and a contest to celebrate the revelation of Pokemon number 251, Celebi. The contest would have 251 winners sending in their gold and silver game cartridges to have Celebi added, and then have them returned. If you didn't have gold or silver, however, you could opt to win a t-shirt instead. A funny thought is that the t-shirts are probably worth way more than the digital prize is today, since we can all just spite the code cop and put Celebi into our own games with Game Sharks. This feature-rich issue contains a few more game reviews, including some in the form of a feature called Game Boy A Go-Go, and then arrives at the Now Playing section. Here we get to see actual review scores from the Nintendo Power staff, mostly of games that were featured in reviews earlier throughout the magazine. It's interesting that some of these games were actually given low scores despite receiving multiple page features in this issue. While Castlevania, Circle of the Moon, Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2, Bomberman Tournament, and Choo Choo Rocket receive fairly high scores, Lufia and Alone in the Dark don't, and show us the lowest that the staff were willing to present, with a 3 and a 2.5. Volume 146 finishes up with a promise to be back next month, and a tease of what they'll have in store for us. I really hope that you enjoyed this look through printed and bound nostalgia, and if you'd like to see more of it in the future, don't forget to subscribe, and to turn on the notification bell. Also, feel free to like the video, it does help me in the algorithm. A chunk of this video was recorded while I was recovering from the virus that shall not be mentioned. So, hopefully my voiceover is acceptable. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next issue.